Right now on Upfront.
Top prosecutor.
We really do need to take the politics out of this.
Brad Schimel appointed interim U.S. attorney in Milwaukee, the Justice Department facing scrutiny, and now the major high-profile trial he'll oversee just weeks away.
Do you believe she's guilty of the charges?
The Wisconsin judge accused of helping an undocumented immigrant evade ICE agents. Now, Brad Schimel one-on-one, the appointment, his push to make it permanent, and the revelations about the plea deal offered to Judge Hannah Dugan.
Lights out.
The regular session of the Senate will come to order.
Wisconsin Eye ending its live coverage of legislative sessions and hearings unless some big-time donors step up. The major financial issues and the millions in taxpayer dollars at stake. Wisconsin Eye President and CEO John Henkes is here.
And it's the economy.
And the thing that I'd ask for the American people is a little bit of patience.
Congress is back, the attention turning to the midterms.
We have a cost of living crisis in the United States of America.
The new nationwide Marquette poll is out, and Charles Franklin is here with the new numbers.
This is Upfront with Jaron Jordan and political director Matt Smith.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A critical court hearing now just days away. The Milwaukee County judge accused of helping an undocumented immigrant evade federal immigration officials now set for her final pretrial hearing on Wednesday.
Judge Hannah Dugan's federal trial is scheduled to begin in mid-December. And this past week, just days into the job, the new interim U.S. attorney Brad Schimel revealed a plea deal prosecutors have offered.
The former Republican state attorney general and candidate for state Supreme Court, Brad Schimel, was sworn in as interim U.S. attorney in Milwaukee this past week, appointed by Attorney General Pam Bondi, coming only after a breakdown in the way U.S. attorneys are typically nominated.
After about 6 weeks, I think I checked in. I found some people who could find out what happened with the Senator Commission, and they did and told me it failed.
Usually, Wisconsin's U.S. Senators, Democrat Tammy Baldwin and Republican Ron Johnson, recommend a list of candidates to a 6-person commission. None, though, received enough votes to advance to the U.S. Senate for approval, including Schimel.
I think if I hadn't checked, we might all still be wondering. So I found out the commission failed, which means the other alternative is not a presidential appointment, but an interim appointment by the U.S. Attorney General. And if she makes that, it's temporary, 120 days. And then you can either try to get the president to nominate you and get Senate approval the typical way, or you can try to convince a majority of the district judges in the federal district to, I don't know what term they use for it, maybe ratify you continuing as a U.S. attorney.
Schimel says that's now his goal over the next 120 days as he becomes part of a Justice Department facing scrutiny nationwide. Accusations from Democrats President Trump is using the department to prosecute his enemies.
What is your role as U.S. attorney, especially when you look at all the politics and really a lot of spotlight on the Justice Department nationally right now?
I think the best thing we can do as a Department of Justice is make sure we're checking our politics at the door. Get in the office, do the right thing, enforce the law the way it's written, enforce it without regard to who a person is or who they voted for, who they support, where they come from. Do that. Be objective. That's the best thing we can do because we really do need to take the politics out of this.
Do you think that's happening in every district across the country?
I have no way of knowing. I mean, I'm on day 3, and I know here, as I've come to this office, I haven't found anything that seems remotely political.
Schimel, though, will now oversee one of the most politically charged arrests and prosecutions during the Trump administration, that of Milwaukee County Judge Hannah Dugan. FBI Director Kash Patel publicly touting the April arrest in a social media post. Dugan accused of helping an undocumented immigrant evade ICE agents after appearing in her courtroom. The trial now set for December, and Schimel revealing on his first days on the job a plea deal federal prosecutors have offered.
You're coming in just before this trial is expected to start. What do you see as your role in that?
I'm not going to have a role in this. There are 3 prosecutors in this office who are very experienced trial attorneys who have been preparing for this case. and they're ready to go. This thing's coming right up. There's a final pretrial next Wednesday where the judge is going to be wanting to make sure the attorneys have everything in order, ready for a trial, or is probably going to want to know, is there a chance that we're going to resolve this? Who knows what's going to happen? They're ready for that. This is no place for somebody to come and jump in and interfere with the hard work they've done. No way.
You mentioned the opportunity for a resolution, as you put it. Is there an opportunity for a resolution ahead of this trial?
There always is that possibility. Judge Dugan is, at this point, she's charged. She's innocent until proven guilty, and right now no one's proven her guilty of anything. Her lawyers have made very clear that she maintains her innocence. But it's irresponsible if the prosecutors and the defense attorneys don't talk about whether there's a possibility for some resolution short of trial. And absolutely, like any other case, those conversations happened.
Can you give any insight into what that offer entails?
No, because I could compromise the defendant's rights. I could compromise her reputation. That would be absolutely inappropriate.
Fair to say, Judge Dugan's team has not accepted this offer?
Correct.
When you look broadly at this case, is this a fair prosecution?
This prosecution has survived the appropriate levels of getting an indictment, survived a motion to dismiss. It has so far survived those things. Prosecutors they have done this ethically. They have followed the law. Ultimately, whether she's violated the law is going to be up to a jury. That's all I can really say about that.
Is there any scenario where charges would be dismissed or dropped as part of any deal?
I can't comment on what kind of negotiations are happening.
But when you look at the attention this trial has garnered and will garner if it does go to trial, what do you make of the FBI director posting the picture the Justice Department weighing in? Have you taken, is the Justice Department telling you how to prosecute this case from up top?
I'm actually not familiar with whatever you're referring to as. I don't know. Yeah. I haven't seen that.
Is DOJ, is the Attorney General offering any guidance on how they would like you to proceed?
In any case of any significance, the Office of the Attorney General in Washington, D.C. is certainly going to look to approve of any negotiations that happen. Sure.
Is this an important case, broadly?
Absolutely. The public on both sides of the political spectrum is very animated by this case. We're preparing here for a busy time when that trial happens, and what we need as the professionals involved here is to make sure that when the outcome does happen, whatever it is, that the public has confidence that the justice system did as it was supposed to do. We have that serious responsibility here.
Do you believe she's guilty of the charges?
That's the decision for a jury to make.
Let's bring in Dan Adams, a former prosecutor and a defense attorney not associated with the Dugan case. Dan, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
You bet.
So we just heard from Brad Schimmel there. Is there any scenario that a deal is made in this case before trial?
Oh, I think so, Jaron. Listen, in every single case in the American criminal justice system, there is the opportunity to resolve the case with a plea deal. The sides get together, they negotiate. The telltale sign of a good deal is both sides don't like the outcome. Here, there's two different charges. I could see, coming down from 2 charges to 1. Or usually on the federal system, there is an agreement as to where the government will be making their recommendation in terms of a sentence. But for Hannah Dugan's point of view, both of these are felonies. She's a sitting circuit court judge in the state of Wisconsin. A felony for her would be a terrible detriment, may result in her losing her judicial seat. So there's a lot of tension here. I don't think the U.S. government would come down to a misdemeanor But again, this whole thing is very dynamic. So could a deal happen? Certainly.
Brad Schimmel, just day 2, 3 on the job when we were talking with him. This is really the first time we've heard from federal prosecutors and their side. Did anything surprise you about potentially how open he was?
Well, there's a reason for that. Prosecutors have an extra ethical duty not to talk about cases, not to put their thumb on the scale in public. Really, they let the indictment or the complaint do the talking, as it were, something that's a public document. They're not able to go out and do press conferences and ring the bell about somebody's guilt. And he was pretty good about saying, listen, she's maintaining her innocence. She has a presumption of innocence, and it's up to the jury to decide one way or the other. Obviously, the government thinks she's guilty. Otherwise, they wouldn't proceed with the prosecution.
Jury questionnaires are out, and there was a lot of back and forth over what to include in those. Potential jurors are being asked about their news habits and any past political activities, but the judge rejected asking about religious affiliations and any political stickers or signs they may display. What does that underscore and the importance of that?
Well, again, as Brad Schimmel talked about in your interview, this is a highly political case in a swing state where there's people all over the political spectrum. And you can imagine if you come to the jury box having a very strong political sentiment one way or the other, where you may be thinking this case will go in your ultimate deliberation. What the parties want to do is kind of flesh those issues out, see people's background. If they're hyper-political in one way or the other, they want to know that beforehand. So when they're deselecting jurors for that jury panel, they can do so with a little bit of discrimination, I guess you could call it, towards these kind of hyper-political people. I imagine Hannah Duggan wants people from the left side of the spectrum. The government may want people who are a little more conservative.
Judge Duggan and her team have insisted on her innocence. We've mentioned, yes, there is a potential that this gets settled, but given the sides that both sides have taken, I mean, is this ultimately going to go to trial, do you think?
If I were a betting man, I think it's going to go to trial.
Yeah.
There's just so much here, even the elements of both the crimes charged. There's wiggle room there. How do these facts apply to these laws? I think there's plausible arguments for the defense, to say the least. And I think, again, given the nature of who may be on this jury panel, I think they've got a pretty triable case here.
Dan Adams, thanks so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Anytime.
Up next, the funding plea. Wisconsin Eye going dark if donors don't step up. $10 million from the state on the line. WIS Eye's President John Henkes is with us next.